That somebody is me, actually. So.
So we're going to fast forward a little bit more. There was a Supreme Court case decided in 2021 called Brnovich versus Democratic National Committee, where the court looked at a different part of the Voting Rights Act, this time Section 2. So, Martin, you and I talked about not too long ago this fact that there's maybe one hole poked in the Voting Rights Act, and that's not a good thing. Turns out there are more. Also, side note, am I saying this name right? Brnovich? Martin, I'm going to send it to you so that you can see how it's spelled, because I want you to guess how you would say it.
Yeah, Brnovich.
So we're doing our best, and sorry if we're putting disrespect on the former Arizona Attorney General's name. Although, actually, I'm only a little sorry because he seems to have done some questionable things related to an investigation of 2020 election results in Arizona, which is a different topic for another episode, maybe? Yeah. Martin, any initial reactions just to this guy and his name?
Wow. Reactions to this guy and his name. I do feel like that's a whole other episode, potentially. Yeah, I'm trying to see how to phonetically say it. It's got to be Brnovich, though.
Listeners, you can tell us how we can learn how to pronounce consonants that don't have a vowel interrupting them. Also, side note to the side note, in this Supreme Court case, the defendant in the initial case was Brnovich, the Arizona Attorney General. But in the Supreme Court case, his name appears first, while the DNC, Democratic National Committee, was the plaintiff in the initial lawsuit, but their name appears second. There's a reason for that, because trials and appeals have to be difficult and things don't make sense in many law things. We'll cover that in another episode. All right, Martin, do you even know what we were talking about before all these side notes and digressions?
No, I'm a little lost.
All good. So we are now talking about Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which contains language that tracks with the 15th Amendment that you so beautifully read for us. So let me set the scene and the context for you again. Bear with me again. In level 1 of Brnovich, one argument that the DNC made was that Arizona's ballot counting and collection procedures negatively impacted the state's American Indian, Hispanic, and African American citizens in violation of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. To get a little more specific, one thing that the DNC was challenging was a rule in Arizona that a vote made in the wrong precinct didn't count. And so listeners know I'm greatly simplifying here. You can imagine how easy it could be to accidentally vote in the wrong place if, say, you didn't fully understand the procedures, or if you didn't have access to the voting place where your mailing address is, but you actually live in your car or are crashing with a friend. So there's myriad reasons why a person might accidentally vote in the wrong precinct. So in the Brnovich history, the trial court rejected all of the DNC's claims. So the DNC lost on all of their claims, and the DNC appealed. Some appeals happened, which I'm greatly glossing over, and the case made it to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court not only rejected the DNC's claims, but found that the voting procedures did not violate Section 2, which, like the 15th Amendment, because again, the language tracks very closely to the 15th Amendment, Section 2 is supposed to make it easier for people of color to vote, not harder. As you may have guessed, I did not read the full court opinion and implore you, dear listener, to do your own research. But to me, this ruling is kind of trash. And numerous advocacy organizations view Brnovich as a case that makes it harder to use the Voting Rights Act to challenge discriminatory election practices. And I'm going to have to agree. In fact, one article I read described, and Martin's going to keep me honest because he knows sports, described Shelby County as the alley-oop and Brnovich as the dunk. Martin, now that you've patiently sat through this exposition, Does this all make sense? And what are your thoughts?
Excellent sports analogy. I think sounds accurate.
I didn't make it up again. It was in an article that I read. Can't take credit.
It's. I guess it makes sense in the context of the history. A little lost.
It's all good. So I'm glad Martin is pointing this out, because I realized in our first episode, as I was describing the Shelby County case, might have been a little ambitious to try to summarize in a few seconds/minutes these very complicated Supreme Court decisions. But the key points to keep in mind here are the Democratic National Committee. And for listeners who are not familiar, we have committees for our two main political parties. The DNC wanted to challenge certain voting procedures that were on the books in Arizona. And their challenge was, these procedures make it harder for people of color to vote. And a district court in Arizona disagreed with the arguments and found in favor of the Attorney General. And we will get into in another episode why a political organization might sue the Attorney General. Oftentimes that's the party to sue if you're going after a state process or procedure. Minor digression. So in this case, the Democratic National Committee lost on level 1. They appealed. Some things happened. They made it to the Supreme Court, and they lost there as well. And the importance of this Brnovich case is that for many folks that do political advocacy, voting rights work, Brnovich represented yet another hole being poked at the Voting Rights Act. So if Shelby County was the hole that was poked at Section 5/4B, Brnovich was poked at Section 2. There's not that many sections of the Voting Rights Act. And so we have these two gaping holes that take this monumental piece of legislation, as Martin pointed out earlier in the episode, considered one of the most important pieces of legislation. Now we have these two gaping holes. So I ask listeners, I ask Martin, how effective can it be with these two gaping holes? Martin, does that help?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, the summary helps it out so much. And like, looking at the Wikipedia too, specifically, the tension was about Arizona's election policies, one outlawing ballot collection and another banning out of precinct voting, as you mentioned. And it's just, yeah, I mean, these poking of holes, it's wild. You know, you look at them and the 15th Amendment, and it's less than 50 words, and it seems pretty clear and straightforward, you know. However, of course, there's all these mental, maybe physical gymnastics done to try to undermine the spirit of what that amendment is saying. So,
Martin, implicit in what you're saying is that the Voting Rights Act has been significantly eroded, and listeners and you and I might be wondering what can be done to curtail this erosion. There has been a solution proposed. Martin, are you familiar with the John Lewis Act?
Yes, often cited as the John Lewis Voting Rights Act.
What do you know about the John Lewis Voting Rights Act?
I don't know what it details, but I imagine it's giving power back to the Voting Rights Act. And you know, obviously, John Lewis was a freedom rider, right? And one of the people who we mentioned earlier was riding on buses and protesting and being in the streets and being beat and hosed and had the dogs sicked on him. For the act itself, I'm not sure what it details, but I imagine it gives maybe the federal government power again for pre-clearance and helping shape some of the state's election laws.
That is an excellent guess. I also just want to take a quick pause here to encourage listeners who are not familiar with the United States history or are not familiar with the Freedom Riders or the civil rights protests that happened in the sort of 1950s and 60s, and even before and after, to be totally honest. But if you're not familiar with who John Lewis is, highly recommend doing your research on him. What an incredible historical figure. And as Martin pointed out, he put himself at great bodily risk, great bodily harm A lot happened to him physically, and he is an icon in civil rights history. So with that aside, Martin has pretty much hit the nail on the head in terms of summarizing the John Lewis Voting Rights Act proposal. It's proposed to directly address Shelby County and Brnovich and to restore the rights that were established by the pre-clearance requirement and make it easier to challenge voting discrimination under Section 2. To give you some history, it passed the House vote in 2021 and 2022, but died in the Senate both times, and it's been reintroduced since, but still has not overcome all the various legislative hurdles. So, Martin, what do you think? I mean, do you think we need this act?
It seems like we do. I mean, just from what it details and how it's been used in an example. I mean, clearly we do. It's such an important thing to be able to vote. And every time, as we kind of mentioned in the episode, it seems like we reach these milestones and we win these victories, and yet every single time there's this backlash and this wave pushing back to try to, take us one step backwards, but then we just have to keep stepping twice forward.
That's right. Well, listeners, we've reached the part of our episode where we give you a call to action. There's a lot here. Voting rights are being challenged, and voter suppression and intimidation is on the rise. This is in addition to Supreme Court decisions that make it much harder to challenge this kind of activity. But there are things that you can do. We're going to post some resources and make them available through our social media. There's a few ideas we have, and we encourage you to share if you have others. One thing to do is to know your rights, and the ACLU has some great guidance on knowing your voting rights. We also encourage you to contact your local officials. Contact them to champion and pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Act so that we can restore what the Shelby County and Brnovich decisions took away. Martin, any other ideas?
Yeah, as a layman, I think just exercising your right to vote, like we talked about in episode 1, it can be grueling. Sometimes it might seem meaningless, and what I'm saying probably sounds pretty cliche, but voting, and part of that is being as informed as you can.
Which is one of the reasons we wanted to do the podcast. We say, and we really mean, don't walk around not knowing.
We also want listeners to feel empowered. So it's not just that it's an era where individuals are maybe causing physical obstacles or literacy obstacles to a vote, but now we have technology enabling voter intimidation and suppression. So if something you heard on the internet doesn't sound right, it might not be. AI is also a tool that's being used to suppress votes. We will talk more about AI on future Lawyer and Layman episodes and how you can be informed, but we want you to just be on the lookout. If there's an image, some text, a video that doesn't sound right, question it. Also, check us out at Lawyer and Layman Pod on Instagram and Lawyer and Layman pretty much everywhere else. Let us know if there's any other topics you'd like us to explain. Don't walk around not knowing.